to the Squamish Nation. And on this piece of land, they're going to be building 3,000 residential units. And I hope that it's going to be a site for future generations to call their own, to be able to embody a different way of being, able to feel at home and grounded on land that feels like it's in good relationship, both with the land, with the rights of the land, as well as the rights of the people whose land this is. I'll invite you, if you feel comfortable to do so, to just type in the chat box, whose land are you on and whose land are you joining us from? I think it's a very important part of our journey towards anti-racism and decolonization to be able to name those lands and understand the stories and the history of the land that we're coming from. The next thing I wanted to do is just remind us to take care of ourselves online. Many of us have been doing these online gatherings for a little while now. And I just wanted to let you know that if you feel the need to turn your screen off, please do so. Speaker mode is sometimes more helpful and easier on the eyes than a full gallery mode. Feel free to move, stretch, mobilize, especially during the break time, whatever you need to do to make sure that your body is being looked after. Hydrate as much as possible. If you're feeling any discomfort as we're going through the content, try to stay with that discomfort, understand where it's coming from, and find your ground through breath and connecting with your body. It's very important that as we share today, we understand consent and confidentiality. So consent meaning that we don't share anything that is outside of what we want to share, and whatever is shared is just the learning and not the story that is shared thereafter. So we're not giving people permission to share our stories, because stories are sacred, unless we expressly get their consent for that. The second last thing is that we want you to expect and accept non-closure. This is long-term work that we're doing. And racism as a system took many, many generations to become so entrenched in our society. And it might take many generations for it to be fully rid of in our society. So let's see this as part of the step along that long journey, and remain committed to that journey as long as difficult it might be. I'm originally from South Africa, and Nelson Mandela had a saying, which means that the road is long, because as they were fighting against apartheid, they didn't know when apartheid would end, if apartheid would end, but they knew that the journey was long and that they needed to keep walking along that long journey together. Just the final thing is, when you're in your breakout rooms, do your best to share the time equitably. If you know that you're someone who tends to speak a lot, use this as an opportunity to listen, to grow your ears. And if you're someone who tends to be more quiet and silent, try use this as an opportunity to speak up and grow your mouth, as they say. Before we get started with today's session, I wanted to just do a recap of some of what we talked about in the last session together. So these were the levels of rank that are developed by Julie Diamond and adapted from the work of Arnold Mendel that we spoke about. And rank you can also think of as power, so different types of power. And we spoke about spiritual and psychological power and how often in social justice work these are ignored, yet they're so important for us to remain committed and doing the work that we need to do to change systems. And then we spoke about social power being local, so that's perhaps within your office, within your community, and the global power systems that exist today. And today we'll be talking mostly about the global systems, but it's worth keeping in mind how these various systems interact with one another. And another reminder of what we covered in the last session was this identity chart. So we can think about the different identities that people might hold and who is privileged and who is not privileged because of the systems of power that exist. So while today we'll be talking mostly about race, we also know that the same patterns of social domination exist when it comes to age, ability, gender, social class, sexual orientation, religion or spiritual traditions, indigenous heritage, national origin, and immigration status, as well as us as humans over other living beings, the system of anthropocentrism that we all benefit from because our needs are privileged over the needs of the environments around us. Okay, with that being said, I'll hand over to Dr. Musa, who will talk us through the context of the particular discussion that we'll be going into today.
Thank you so much, Ashlam, and good morning or good afternoon, all of you in Toronto there. I'm sitting in the Lokungeni speaking people territory here in Victoria, and it is an honor because I'm an invited guest as an immigrant coming from Senegal in West Africa. The beautiful connection between Aslan and myself is that I lived for many years in South Africa and went to school in Durban. So my 40 years in this kind of work, I got them in South Africa. And I was very fortunate to be there when Mala came out. I was fortunate to be there when the election was happening and everything. So it is a blessing and an honor. I want to just add one thing today. As Aslam said, we are doing we are going to be talking about racism. Both of us, we are not in the business of shaming anyone, because you never teach anyone anything by shaming them. Anti-racism work should be more about calling people in, not out. Sometimes we are enraged, we are angry, we might do the calling out, but if we really want to build long-term allyship, thinking about how we can do it by calling in might help. It is another alternative that I privilege myself. In addition to that, I want to just say also, especially that Aslam was talking about Mandela, anti-racism work is 2 or 3 things that also need to be kept in mind. One is that it is about awareness. The second one, it is about action. And the third one, it is about social change. Awareness can be like education. However, great Nelson Mandela reminded us that, education being the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world is one step, especially if we look back and think about what Gandhi added to that. And Gandhi says that in order to change that world, you have to be that change yourself first. So I just want to remind us that this is a context we want you to think about when we're talking about anti-racism, that it is about education to be able to change the world, but that change has to start with ourselves. The context of our work is Black Lives Matter, but it goes beyond it. It is for generations when racism started, and all of us, we started doing this work, and before us also. I am happy Ashlam talk about Martin Luther King. Prejudice and discrimination, as we know, are prevalent in Canadian societies. And many studies have found that racial prejudice and discrimination against BIPOC are crude realities in Canadian society. Systemic racism, however, hinders our human solidarity and our overall capacity to contribute to a healthy, sustainable, and inclusive institutions and society. Silencing critical reflection and denunciation of systemic racism is in our organization will have a terrible impact on the sustainability of our work. And many of us, we have had that experience where our voices have been silenced when we flag the issues of racism or other intersections. Ashlan, you can move to the next one. And today, what we hoping to achieve, Ashlam and I, during this our time together, we hope that by the end of the workshop, you'll be walking away with some experiences, some skills, some tools, and you will be able to expand your awareness of racism against BIPOC people, Black and others, that you will have time to deconstruct systemic racism and its intersections or its relationships to power, privilege, and identities, that you will be able to critically assess the impact of racism on BIPOC people, especially on employees, clients, partners, and all the stakeholders, that you will be able to develop skills on how to effectively address racism and other forms of discrimination by reflecting on policies, yes, policies and organizational management practices that we will have time to practice effective anti-racism intervention skills throughout case studies with reference to our programs, policies, and procedure in your own workplace. I say that because I used to work in the settlement sector. I used to work for ISS of BC, which is the second largest one in Canada. And I worked there for 7 years almost in Vancouver. And this sector is very, very, very dynamic, but I know that it has a lot of challenges with programming, with policies, and everything else. And finally, we hope that at the end of the day today, we will be able to reflect on those key strategies and competencies on how to become an anti-racist ally. So these are some of the things we will do. Now I have a big question for you. Aslam, next slide. The big question I have for you is, oftentimes we hear the word racism, and I have been doing so much work with organizations. We just plug all these beautiful words on their website or so on and don't have any context to it. But here, I want to challenge you and ask you, when you hear or when you think about the word racism, what comes to mind? Aslam is going to put a mirror board and he will explain what it is. And I challenge you, all of you, to take a few seconds and write 1 or 3 words that come to mind when you think or when you hear the word racism.
Thank you very much. So as Dr. Musa said, we're going to ask you to tell us what comes to mind when you hear the word racism. And we've set up these mirror boards, which I'll show you now. And, you know, we tried this last session and we know that sometimes there are some technical difficulties, but it's a good way because of the size of the group to get people to engage. So if you click on the link that's in the chat box, you'll see a screen like this pop up. And on the screen, you'll be able to click on one of these little post-it notes, and you can type in your thoughts, what comes to mind when you hear the word racism. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that. And we also know that sometimes the technical issues come up, so we want to give you a couple of other options. So if this isn't working for you, feel free to share your thoughts, the words that come to mind in the chat box as well. And as we said, if you're having difficulty accessing it, feel free to share the words that are coming up for you in the chat box, and then we'll transfer those words onto the Miro board.
So we have words in the chat, Aslam. We have marginalization.
Marginalization, oppression, indignity,
oppression, indignities.
Unjust oppression, hate.
And we also have more pain, hurt, and unfairness. Okay. How are we doing? So we still have prejudice, non-inclusivity, fear, long-standing abuse. Now people are getting into actions about educating, that there is need for education, learning, and action. So go ahead with a slide, Asma. So I want to invite everyone to pause and look at these slides. Look at the words that are before you here. Just take a moment and look at these words. I want to hear from people. What do you notice, on this screen? What is strike you? What is stand out for you? Anyone? Anyone? What you notice? What is strike you in these words? Yeah, Sabnan is talking about pen. Toyi is talking about negative. Lisa is talking about negative. You can also shout it. The pen, yeah, or you can write it in the chat. Negative words, Alfieri is talking about negative words. Andrew, for the most part, struggle, power, hate, feelings. The number of time, hate, violence. Excellent. So now I'm going to invite you, because you have the mirror in front of you. I'm going to invite you, for those who don't have it, maybe you can even screen save it, or you can take your cell phone and take a picture, because the next activity you're going to use these words. Ashlam, we're going to put people in a break room, and what we want you to do in your break room, that we are going to give you, I think, 10 minutes. We want you to categorize these words under the following 5 headings. So you will take words in the mirror board and see if whether with your group agree with and decide if whether they fall under beliefs, under attitudes, or under behavior, or under impact, or others. So in 10 minutes, your group have to agree on this. And when you finish, you need to nominate someone to report back when we come back in the group, in the big group. So it will be very tight because you only have 10 minutes, and try to find a way to moderate it so that everyone has a say. So for example, Ashlam is giving you some example, belief, attitude, and under attitude, you can put hate, or under behavior, you can put hate crime. So this is just example.
Okay, welcome back, everyone.
So everyone is back, and thank you all for doing this exercise. I say doing it because it's not easy. It's not easy just to talk about racism, as I said earlier. However, this is a task we put in front of you. And I want to say thank you that you take your chances and you take the challenge, you take up the challenge. So now we want to quickly hear from some of the people who categorize their groups. So should we go with the group number 1? The way I'm going to do this, I'm not going to ask you to list everything, but we want to hear from your presenter to tell us, summarize in 1 minute, what was the key things that keep coming under each heading, and how was it? How was the process? So let's hear from group number 1 or room number 1.
Hi, everybody. So we took the words and wrote them down on a piece of paper here in front of me. And I think the most striking thing was that the longest list of words fell under impacts. So it just illustrates that, you know, a few small actions can have an incredible impact and cause the most pain. Some examples under beliefs, we had privilege and white supremacy. Attitudes, we had ignorance, prejudice, hate, behaviors, discrimination, systemic. A couple of impacts we had were injustice, inequity, marginalization, oppression. Yeah, so it just was really insightful looking at the words here that a small, a small amount of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors result in such a long list of impacts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, definitely impact, and that's important because oftentimes when we claim that there is racism, people talk about they oppose to the impact, they oppose intention. They will say, oh, he didn't intend it. However, we know that maybe the intention is not there, but the impact is huge. And we're not being led to talk about the impact. Our voices will be silenced because the moment the person says, I didn't intend it and I'm sorry, then talking about the impact is irrelevant for people. They want you just to say amen and move on. Thank you for this. Group number 2. Yeah. Anything that you strike, just again for number 2.
I'm not actually certain of what my group number was, but I'm happy to go ahead if that's all right, unless
Yes,
someone
go
from
ahead.
group number 2 wants to go. That could very well have been us. Something interesting that we found was that many of the items on the mural board were could cover many categories, and in some situations, defining whether something was a belief or a value, whether it was an attitude or an approach, it was difficult for us to sometimes categorize. But certainly what we did find again was that the list of impacts outweighed many of the other categories as well. And some of the things that came up for us that seemed to cross a lot of categories were concepts of power, concepts of othering and discrimination, and even colonialism, and how the kernels of othering people are what led to this kind of colonial approach, and that it's the impacts that we're finding that are quite definitely like a longer list than some of the other categories. But the thing that struck us most was that it was sometimes difficult, or that a lot of the concepts crossed many of the categories.
Yes. Yeah, the concept crossing many of the categories, because it is a continuum, or I will say it is cyclical, and this is important because oftentimes, again, when we are faced with assessing racism, and especially people who are not at the receiving end, they tend to try to categorize things, even if they don't say, okay, title number 1, beliefs, attitude, etc. But you can see the process, the mindset about saying, how did you feel about it? How did they behave? And then analyze it from there and say, this is why it didn't happen. When in reality, we know that it is cyclical, it is continuous, it's something that is tangible. But if you're looking at the rational mind only, it is very difficult to make it clear. Because if you just say, if I don't hear you say that there was a believing in, I want to see the impact, definitely you will not say. Group number 3.
Sorry, this is Johanna. I'm not sure if we're in group 3, but I'm going to. I'm kind of gonna get on here. And I can't turn on my video. I apologize because my computer freezes up. But we are kind of with group 1 and 2 in here. That our biggest list technically is under the impact section as well. And I'm sorry you can hear my dog.
No.
I find it interesting that the way the categories work is you have a belief, and it doesn't matter if you have 1 or 2 things in that belief, because the belief then goes into what your attitude is going to be based on the belief. And then your behavior is based out of that attitude and that belief, which then goes in to impact others.
Yes.
As with everything else, as I've said, groups 1 and 2, we were with them. Our biggest list is usually under that impact. But, when you have these categories in there, it's one thing that affects the next thing and the next thing and the next. So it pretty much snowballs into this big thing, right?
Definitely, because I think there is a popular saying that say, you are what you think, you are what you eat, you are what. So there is this definitely this continuum, and it is very clear that when we think bad about people, our attitude is impacted by that, and our behavior also. So group number 3 or 4. So let's hear from a few folks, and just throw in your thoughts and what is your observation and what you noticed. Anyone?
So I can go next, and sorry I didn't take my group members names down, but we had more in behavior and impact. Actually, we found it difficult if it's a behavior or an impact. So for example, something like oppression, it's a behavior and it's also an impact, right? Because oppression is a behavior that somebody's exhibiting towards you. And the impact is what the person is not able to do because of the oppressive behavior.
Yeah.
And we touched on a positive one. We thought hard work, and we put that in others. So yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shanda. So I'm going to take another two feedback, and then we move to the next activity. We want to go next.
I can interject. It's based on what Chandra just said, but we had a challenge because each of these words, it depended on how it was framed and who it was framing. Was it the person who was experiencing racism or the person who was perpetrating it? So depending on those framings, for each of these, the word could be placed into a different area.
Yes. I totally agree with you, Patricia, and thank you so much. So yeah, another comment, anyone else? So maybe we should move to...
Hi,
yeah,
I can comment on the word daily, actually, because the word daily is the only word that I see here that is not the same type of word that the other words, but it's cross-cutting all the other categories. So in some way, that word was very important for me, and it's it shows that the impact and everything happens every day and every moment.
Yes.
So that's very important word for me from all these.
Yes. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think in that also I was going to add under others, some of the things we notice is hearing people flagging words like colonialism, you know, the context, the roots of it, talking about history, you know, the societal context, but also systems. So these are 3 or 4 key words that I want you to keep in mind. The definition of racism. Racism is also defined as a form of discrimination or a behavior which is defined as an individual action. So I want to be very clear. Oftentimes people see racism as individual, but we need also to understand that racism can also be an institutional practice, whereas we call it systemic racism. And the individual and the institutional practice of racism treat people differently because of their color or their ethnicity. Aslam, keep going. Aslam, yeah, good, thank you. So racism is also a belief that one group thinks that they are superior to others. We all know those words. So just a reminder. Racism can be openly displayed in racial jokes, in slurs, or hate crime. It can also be more deeply rooted in attitudes, in values, and stereotypical beliefs, as the Ontario Commission of Human Rights pointed out. According to the Oxford Dictionary, racism will translate into prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior to theirs. So again, we want you to think about this. Racism as a belief, racism as an attitude, racism as a behavior, but racism that can also be entrenched in even what people call their values of not wanting to mingle with other people from a racial background, a different racial background. So, and one last piece I want to add is that racism is not just one thing at a time. It can be many. It's not only the blatant incident of racism you see and you call it racism. Racism can be entrenched in the behaviors and the system in a way that it is daily, it is continuous. And this we call it microaggression. Microaggression can be more than just racism. can be a compound of many other things. Because as you know, we are not only our race. If you look at me and you say he's black, that's one. I give you a 10 out of 10. But there is more to Musa than just being black. There is things that you don't see and you will never know unless I tell you. For example, if I tell you I have 22 brothers and sisters, you will realize that my intersectionality is beyond race. It encompasses many other. So we are going to bring all this now back home and look at your own organizations, how systemic racism plays in your organization, but most importantly, whether your organization is ready to take on anti-racism work. So I pass it to Aslam to explain again this mural. And you had already the homework, and we hope that you have had time to do it. Otherwise, we will find time to do some of it. Aslam, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick recap. So these were sent to you in the pre-reading package. So this is an organizational anti-racism readiness strategy or checklist that you can use. So as a LIP coordinator, think about, are you ready for anti-racism work? Are your partners ready for it? And here's some questions that you can use to assess the readiness. So there's questions about policies, guidelines, and practices. There's questions around leadership. There's questions around employee evaluation. And finally, some indicators for inclusiveness, which include, again, employee evaluation, but particularly for Indigenous, Black, and racialized staff in your organization. So I know many of you have had a chance to look through this and share some of your thoughts. And we'll just go through some of what was shared right now.
Yes.
So as some folks went through it, they shared that what they learned is how far they are from actually being a racially just organization, how immigrants are expected to adjust to the culture, whether it's Canadian culture or organizational culture, how immigrants are expected to adjust again. What was surprising for someone was that there's so many things that need to change before we can battle racism effectively. So going through this readiness document, I see that my organization doesn't seem to be ready for change. And I think this is in the wake of George Floyd's murder, so many organizations like realizing, systemic racism is something that we need to talk about. It appears in our organization, and rushing to book workshops and rushing to do something about it. But without taking stock and evaluating internally, are we ready for this? What does it require for us to change? Do we have the right people on board? How are we treating the people that are here already? We had another question that asked, what are some of the next steps that can be taken by your LIP or your partners to make anti-racism work? So some said more professional development for all the partners in the space, and hard conversations are another thing that need to be had. And the final reflection question is, what type of support do you need to engage deeper in this anti-racism work? And I think, looking at the whole system and the structure, and if funding models are reinforcing white supremacy culture, that needs to change. We also need some practical tools, and hopefully we'll be talking about some of those today. Permission from funders, and I think this is also one of those subtle things that need to be thought about and discussed with partner organizations, with philanthropy bodies, to think about where did philanthropy come from? How is the entire thinking about the sector changing from time to time? And then the grant agreements are reflective of this work. So that's just a little bit about what was shared so far. This board is available to you, so I'll encourage you to look through it when you get a chance, and add your own thoughts. So this can be a shared resource for everybody who's on this call for LIP coordinators across the country, that as you go through these readiness surveys, think about what you're learning, what you're missing, and use this as a place where you can share some of those learnings with one another.
Yes. The readiness tool is a great tool that I use when I'm helping organizations develop what we call their EDI program or framework. One of the things that I came across and realized is that they jump to talk about EDI and they limit it. The piece on anti-racism become just performative. So I have challenged some of those organizations or a school board I have worked with and tell them, are you ready? Are you ready? And they say, oh, yes, we're ready. I say, well, it is just you in this room are ready because you are the leaders. So if you allow me, I will use a tool and send it to the whole institution, and we will see, and then we collect the data and talk about it. And the surprise is always there. When the data come back, the leaders realize that their understanding and the rest is not the same. So it takes courage, but I really encourage you. You don't have, if you are in your organization, just take one. Let's take number one on the policy, principle of anti-racism, anti-Black racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion are clearly articulated in the organization mission statement and strategic plan, where applicable, and in all policy guidelines and procedure. Just send this to your coworkers and say yes, no, what, don't know, and hear from them what they share. Like once a month or once a week, depending on your staff meeting, have one of these elements and have a conversation and collect anonymously the data. You will be surprised what will come out. And if you are really serious about anti-racism and EDI framework development, you will realize that there is more work to be done than what you think. So just to share with you this, I want to also recognize that this tool, I adapted it from the Humber College, which is in Ontario, and have been using it, and acknowledging it. So please, if you're going to use it also, recognize that you adapted it from Humber College, because the original came from them. Thank you. So Ashlam, any maybe we open it for 1 minute or two and hear if people have any comment, anything. Any question, any comment, anyone? Yes?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm thinking this through as I'm talking, so please forgive me if it's not an elegant statement, but I'm a firm believer that organizations need to go through this. And I also know from experience that it's extremely messy and there's a lot of liability that's involved for organizations. And so I can give you some examples. So for instance, when we've tried to do this with our partners, one of the things our partners have been telling us is we would really like to see examples of what other organizations are doing. We'd like to see examples of progressive policies. We'd like to see examples of innovative thinking around this. So we said, fine. So we asked our partners to share those policies as best practices within a small circle, and nobody shared. And when we went back and said to people why, the answer was because they're scared, because nobody's sure that they're doing the right thing. And they're worried that if they put a policy out there and then somebody spots something wrong with it, it could have HR ramifications, it could have employment law ramifications, etc. So that's one complexity. Another complexity is that when you work in a sector that bills itself as progressive, you very quickly run into tensions among different progressive principles. So for example, there have been instances where the sort of the values that govern unions, which we all broadly support, have run counter to the values that would allow organizations to promote and rectify historic injustices. Because often with unions, seniority trumps most other things. And the people who are most entrenched through seniority are often not those from marginalized communities, right? And so you end up very quickly in these kinds of internal conflicts. Do you have any suggestions on how to move forward with that?
Yes, the suggestion I give to organization is that everything has to be tied back to the strategic plan, and the policies, there need to be a gap analysis of the policy and the language. But most importantly, you can't start this process without involving not only the union, but the management, senior management, but also the staff. One organization I have been working with, what I encourage them to do is to create a committee, a committee or an advisory committee. And that committee has to take responsibility to present to everyone before they even launch into doing their work. So communication has to be clear and it has to be overall. That's one thing. Second thing, your senior management people who are going to make the decision and implement an anti-racism training should be the first one to be trained, and to be given enough understanding about what is racism and why it is important in the organization. So there is layers, and it's cyclical. You can't just say, I'm done doing this, but you have to come back and go back to people and back and forth. So you're right, the challenges are there, and organizations are scared of showing flaws in their policies or their program. But that's the reality, and because this is messy. However, one last thing I want to add. If you go and say we're doing diversity hiring and you bring all these Black people, beautiful people like myself in your organization, and you train your staff to understand that this is not just because we want to do window dressing, but you make it clear that these Black people are here because they have the skills, they can do the job, and your staff understands the reason why you bring in more diversity. If you don't do that, you will set those Black people to failure, because the gatekeepers will be after them 24 hours a day. And they will never understand. Yeah. So that's why. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you, but it doesn't sort of address the issue that I was having, which is that there are entrenched interests at play, right? So I will again give you a concrete example. If you, for instance, you want to create a position that's going to work with a, let's use, I don't know, with a particular community, right? And you want to make sure it's a management position and you're going to put somebody in it who's from that community, and they're going to, they're going to be reflective, they're going to have the skills. Very often you will run into problems with the union, which says, no, you should be promoting the people who are already here. You should be, hiring internally from the union, promoting the people who've put in their time. So oftentimes you actually, despite the fact that I think unions generally are progressive, you do run against entrenched interests within the existing employees and the organization.
I hear you. I totally hear you. And this is one of the things maybe organizations have to go back to the drawing board when you are negotiating with the union, and maybe try to see if there is a way to put a specific clause in those negotiations to talk about things like this. Again, as I say, the communication need to be there, and the union need to see the strategic interest for this kind of work. Yeah, but if you don't add it to the collective agreement negotiation, oftentimes later on, if you want to bring it as an add-in, definitely there is also resistance. And I hear you. You're just making me laugh because I have survived a few things like this. When I started doing anti-racism work in my university here, I was called in by some people saying that I am traumatizing white people because I'm making them feel very uncomfortable that they are all racist. That's what I was given. And I said to the person, listen, they hire me for this job. If you guys are not interested, fire me. Because this is what I was hired to do, and I will do it. But again, you're right. The union needs to be brought on board. When? It might be during the framework negotiation. Thank you so much for this question. So Aslam, are you going to take a break now?
Yeah, I think maybe if I can just respond to one of the other points that was made around the idea of perfectionism, right? So if you've read through, one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture is this idea of like, we need to get it perfect before we put it out there. And this is part of the cultural dynamic that exists that needs to be challenged. We need to be able to be okay with failure. We need to be okay with putting something out there, getting called out on it, accepting the truth in what's being said, making adjustments, and putting something else out there. Because this is perhaps one of the biggest stumbling blocks or like barriers to doing active anti-racism work, is the fear that we're not going to get it perfect.
Yeah.
And if we allow that fear to stop us from acting, then this work will never get done. So we need to be able to push past that. We need to have internal strength and resilience to say, yeah, we are going to get some things wrong. And if we share, and if someone tells us that we're wrong, that's a good thing. It means that we are on this learning journey, as opposed to never starting it to begin with.
Yeah. And for me, that's good conversation, because if you don't get those kind of resistance and questioning, then you don't know where you're going. So you need to have people resisting and challenging the process and asking questions, because the union also, there is the unions, and I have experience of union or union members who are very proactive once they know that it doesn't affect their mission statement, and then you can work with them. So the conversation, the communication, and being able to be very upfront can really help in some situations. Let's take a 5-minute. Aslam, should we go for 5 or 10? 5?
I think 5 minutes is good. Just a quick bio break. So we'll be back at 12 minutes past the hour. Okay, welcome back, everyone. You're on mute, Dr. Musa. Quote of 2020/2021.
So, excellent. So thank you so much, everyone, and welcome back. We hope that the conversation we had so far has given you some food for thought, and especially talking about, when you think about racism, what comes to mind, and realizing this continuum or cyclical nature, that racism is not only a belief, it is embedded in beliefs, attitude, and behavior, but also the impact is there, and there is somehow some kind of roots and common foundation to racism. And we did talk a bit in the list of others. We talked about colonialism, we talk about systemic racism, which we will talk more. And now we are going to go and maybe explore more systemic racism, its roots, and how it manifests in our organizations. So we will show you a brief video of 4 minutes. And after the video, what is going to happen, we will put you into your breakout room and ask you to think about how systemic racism manifests in your organization. As a best practice, when you show in a video in Zoom, it is always good to also copy the same link in the chat, just for people who can't see the video very clearly, then they can look at it on their own things. So in your chat, I just copied and send you the video, so all of you can watch it if ever you have challenges. So without further ado, Aslam is going to play the video.
Canada has been really good at convincing itself and the world that the terrible things that come out of colonization somehow didn't happen here.
There's no systemic discrimination. There's no system in Quebec.
Thank God that we're different than the United States.
Their denial is part of the system of systemic racism.
It's an inaccurate history.
This country was founded on systemic discrimination.
We don't talk about the origins, where it comes from, how our whole society is based on white male superiority.
Systemic racism is the normalizing of racism.
It's not directly in your face.
Systemic racism is something that touches every corner of our country, every corner of our institutions.
Commissioner Brenda Lucky said she struggled with the term systemic racism. Later, the commissioner said it does exist in the RCMP.
We definitely have that in the RCMP, and we are not immune to it at all.
These are institutions that were built with the intention and the understanding that they were not really to service people who are not white. There are these myths that we are so radically different from the US. Both countries are founded out of stolen and colonized land. Both countries have attempted genocide on indigenous peoples. Both countries have long histories of slavery.
It's easy to point somewhere else, and it's another form of gaslighting.
In Canada, we talk a lot about, the Underground Railroad. Black people escaping slavery and coming to Canada. But we don't also talk about how after the end of the Civil War in the US, that many of those same Black people went back to the US. And why did they go back? Because on the other side of the border, things were just as bad.
The police target and brutalize and kill Black and Indigenous people. We're literally paying for police officers to brutalize and kill us at disproportionate rates.
One of the officers shot him dead.
Moore was shot and killed by a police officer.
I don't understand how someone dies during a wellness check.
The family says the 29-year-old was alone in the unit with officers when she plunged to her death.
Inexplicably killed. Rodney Levi, shot by RCMP.
The ones we see in the media now are just the most recent ones. We've had hundreds and hundreds of cases of brutality and violence, sexualized violence, killings that have never been addressed.
Let's look at the ways this structure has historically been used.
People who were enslaved would run away because they were property, not only labor, they were labor and property. Their masters, the owners would want them back, and they would hire to go catch them. And police forces emerged out of that.
The whole purpose of the RCMP on the prairies specifically, but across Canada generally, was really to suppress Indigenous dissent.
They were also used to take children, put them into residential schools, not follow up on complaints of the sexual abuse that was going on there.
Black and Indigenous people make up nearly 40% of our federal prison population, while comprising less than 10% of the general population.
So much of the interpersonal stuff that happens between people that policing is now involved in can be better handled in communities when communities are given and have the resources to deal with interpersonal conflict.
A CBC News investigation 2 years ago found nearly half of Canadians who died in encounters with police since the year 2000 were mentally distressed.
Yeah, so thank you all for watching this. Now we're going to put you in your breakout rooms. And the question, as I say, this was to look at the systemic. Now we're going to look at the systems in your organizations, your institution, that may, and I want to stretch the word may, just to give you enough room to think that it is not only what is happening, but what can happen if things are not looked at closely. So what are the systems in your institution and organization that may support, reinforce, or perpetuate racism, especially in the settlement sector? And I ask these questions because, as I say, I used to work as an integration officer in the settlement sector. And believe me, I have my own experiences of how this works. And I have experienced discrimination, I have experienced racism. So now your turn, I'm asking you not what are those experiences, but what are the systems that can really reinforce, support, or perpetuate this kind of racism in the sector. So we will give you 15 minutes for that in your breakout room. We want you to do three things. Discuss the system, and together you have to make a list of 3 to 5 key examples of system in your settlement sector. And you have to have a volunteer who will report like we did last time. Maybe, and also, sorry, a volunteer to report back, but also we will ask your group while you're doing that brainstorming to use a mirror. And Ashlam is going to explain to you the mirror before he put you up on that link. And then we send you to breakout room. So Ashlam and Jesse.
So the mirror for this is just a simple like post-it sticky place for you to just share the systems that are coming to mind as you discuss in your group, and then you'll have a chance to share back in the bigger group. So the types of systems and how it impacts the settlement sector is a question that came in the chat box. So it would be like, how does systemic racism show up, right? Like, how does it, like, what are the Is it through the funding models, as some people have already alluded to? Is it through the way that language is used? Is it through the way that written documents are used? So what are the ways that these systems show up?
No worries. So we're going to continue this conversation because I hope that it is not the last time. Because one of the questions I will be tempted to ask you is that we know now what is racism, or we talked about, how it play out in the behavior, attitude, and beliefs. We are talking about system of racism, and the big question I have is how to turn this around, how to address these systemic issues. But let's first hear more about systems, and thank you all for coming back. So the debrief question we have is to hear from you and tell us briefly, again, maybe 1 minute or less, talk about those systems. And I will just do it the popcorn and from 2 or 3 people to report to us. And you have also the Miro board for all of you that you can access and look at more of those things and take it back to your organization and have conversation with the co-workers. But let's hear from 1 or 3 people, 3 people here. Anyone, you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and go ahead.
All right, Prince here. We're from British Columbia, Toronto, and York region. So I'll touch on 3 issues really. One is the nature of the funding and the funding models and how they affect systems and organizations. They come from a wide dresses usually lens or from a historical perspective of white privilege, such that it's not so much who can access our services, but are you poor enough to access our services? And that affects who we serve. And usually we're talking, for instance, with, community legal clinics that will put all these barriers in terms of who can access IRCC is very notorious for that, who can access language service, settlement services, and all that stuff. So those barriers usually impact people of low income, people of color, and immigrants, and they do impact staff morale as well. We talked about unionization and the lack of transparency. While unionization in the nonprofit sector do help, we acknowledge they do help slightly increase wages. They have failed to raise unionization within the nonprofit sector has failed to raise wages to be anything competitively compared to the for-profit sector. So you'll find that a caseworker within the nonprofit sector compared to the same person doing the same job in the for-profit sector, teaching English as second language, what it is, the unionization have not done much to advance that. While they've done a slight improvement, but the biggest thing we found with unions within the sector is that they actually propagate and promote entrenched systems. The lack of transparency between the working class and actually the what happens. Are they in bed? The unions, are they in bed with the employers to the detriment of staff, especially when it that. So the other one is HR practices. While most seemingly entry-level jobs for most agencies now require at minimum a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, you'll find that at senior management or director level, there's no such requirement in most cases. And we do acknowledge that most of these so-called seniors, directors level jobs are people that have been there 20, 30 years in the agency who are predominantly white. At the time they went in, it's acknowledged that probably it was not a requirement to even have a degree. So they have advanced. But somebody coming in through the express entry system or economic immigrants that make the bulk of folks that are coming in, by very minimum standards, by very minimum requirement of going through the economic immigrant stream, you require at least a bachelor's degree, and most of these people have postgraduate degrees, and they have over 20 years experience. That's not even recognized when they get into the gate. So some of the recruitment practices and policies that seem very subtle actually narrow the gate even for those that are going to entry-level positions, that they come in with a high degree of experience and high degree of education, reporting to people that might have similar experience, but because their experience is downplayed or not recognized because it was from Bangladesh or Zimbabwe or wherever. So the subtle recruitment practices that limit who goes where and the self-perpetuating. Okay, I'll stop there.
Prince, I think you just covered all of it. So thank you so much. And I really like your passion in talking about this, because this is a reality for many of us. It is crude reality. So thank you so much. I am also going back to the mirror board and some of the things that has been posted there. Ashlam, I go back to you. Can you, is there something that strike you in that list that you want to add to what we heard from Prince?
With many of the things, I'm curious if anybody has in the group just something that, yeah.
Yeah.
I could add one thing that I don't think I heard from Prince, and we talked a little bit about, and I don't know if it's on the Miro board, but the thing that we do in the sector often is to promote success stories of newcomers, and we were talking a little bit about how this idea of presenting outstanding achievements by newcomers as the sort of standard of what it is to be a valuable newcomer in Canadian society creates a situation in which newcomers, and particular BIPOC newcomers, are valued based on being outstanding or making outstanding contributions, and not valued inherently as human beings. So maybe not a completely formed thought, but just that idea that this prioritization of telling success stories about outstanding individuals creates a standard that really people are valued only if they can do something for the rest of society, something outstanding.
Yes, definitely. And I think also there is a couple of things that stand out for me in the list. It is the tokenism. I think Chris alluded to it, where minority people are being put in the organization. And versus when we're talking about anti-racism, who is expected to do the anti-racism work, and how they are being remunerated and recognized in the organizations. This is also another problematic issue that I see happening, because my own experience starting a company and starting my consultancy business was because of that. I was working in a structure that didn't even want to give me one day to go to school to do my master's degree. And when I finished my master's and I was presenting at Immigration Canada Conferences Metropolis, it is when I'm realizing when I came back home, my bosses were interested in my thesis. And I say to myself, they will have to pay for every single sentence I'm going to share with them. And I started doing workshops. And this is how I set myself. But again, it is just to say how, this work needs to be not only done, but it needs to be recognized and remunerated correctly. And most importantly, that you can't do it if you don't look at the hiring practices. So the hiring is crucial. So now, Ashlam, we're going to move to the lecturate, and I'm just going to summarize this before we go to the last part of this workshop today. So what we want to share with you is that when we talk about systemic racism, it is very important for us to remember that systemic racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representation, and other norms in various ways often reinforce ways to perpetuate racial group inequities. If you look at the three analogies from la table de concertation contre le racisme systémique, if you look at the three analogies, it is very clear what they tell you about systemic racism. At the top, the branches and the leaves give you the everyday manifestation of racism. And these can be what we call microaggression and other experiences of BIPOC people. The everyday manifestation are discriminatory and hostile interpersonal practices and encounters. They can be physical aggression, like what I had in a bus reading my book, and someone just grabbing my book and say, "Hey, my friend, you must be lucky to be in Canada and be safe enough that you can read in the bus." Entitlement, and 29 or 30 people in the bus and no one look up to say anything. It can be insult and intimidation. Racial profiling, we know, the Cardin program issues in Toronto or other places, we know, and racial profiling of BIPOC people, not only in organizations, but also in businesses. Discrimination in employment, as we were talking about hiring, promotion, retention, and so on. The trunk of the tree represent what we call the institutional ideologies and the structure. These are the policies and the laws, the rules and the regulation and the certain media. You know, the media contribute a lot to demonizing BIPOC people and cultural practices. So these are the things, and we make a joke when I used to live in France. When a Black person in a French team perform very well, they call him the French team win thanks to Aslam. If Aslam is the one who lost the final goal and the team loses, they will say the team lost because of Aslam, a French from South Africa. Then they will add your name, where you coming from. The system of domination are the roots of racism. And then in those systems, we talk about colonialism. We talk about white supremacy, but hear me very well. White supremacy is not about every white being racist. White supremacy is those whites who are racist we're talking about. So I want to clearly say that not every white is a white supremacist. But white supremacy definitely is in our society in a way that it is not only about individuals, but it can be also systemic. So we have to talk about the system of white supremacy in the next slide. We also have capitalism, we have patriarchy, and we have imperialism. But again, we want to stretch the intersectional nature of racism and systemic racism, that it is not only one thing. When you look at this tree, you realize that they all go together. If you want to root out systemic racism, you need to get rid of the whole tree.
I also wanted to add, one of the things that Doug mentioned is the celebration of certain newcomers. And you'll notice that the newcomers that are celebrated are not the ones who are challenging colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, or imperialism. You know, we typically celebrate the newcomer who started a business and that's a very successful business. Or we celebrate the newcomer who achieved a lot within the colonial education system. They got their PhD or postdoc, or they're outstanding at research within a specific model. But if there's a newcomer who's built strong relationships with indigenous communities, who's standing up for the protection of Mi'kmaq fishing territory, or standing up against a trans-mountain pipeline, all of those things that counter colonialism, white supremacy, those things will not be celebrated. And that's part of the way that the system of domination perpetuates.
Yes. And sometimes also we notice that those who are celebrated sometimes are those who somehow have managed to fit in the system or have weaved in their discourse the language of the system.
Yeah. And it's a tricky game. So it's also a tricky game for newcomers who need to try and make a livelihood for themselves. So then they're forced to assimilate into these systems, but at the same time, these systems are the ones that are pushing them down and pushing against them. Just to expand on the characteristics of white supremacy culture that Dr. Musa mentioned, it's perhaps one of the most poorly understood of these systems of domination. And I think the first time I came across it was only a couple of years ago. And as Dr. Musa said, it's not just about certain individuals having it, because many BIPOC people have internalized this culture. And it's really about a way of being. So earlier we spoke about perfectionism, this idea that if I'm not getting it absolutely right, if I put it out there, it's too much of a risk. So just the fact that we live within this like litigious society where, you know, any sort of mistake is terribly punished is a characteristic of white supremacy culture. Some people shared the sense of urgency when applying for deadlines for grants, just in the day-to-day work, how everything needs to happen right now. And then COVID comes along and we realize actually the thing that we thought was the thing that needed to happen ASAP could actually be postponed for 2 months or 3 months. And we are better for it. Our well-being is better for it. And this is some of the ways that white supremacy culture harms white people as well as people of color, because it's a culture that creates a sense of defensiveness, that promotes quantity and overworking. It worships the written word, so verbal communication is not counted, right? If you have a conversation with someone and agree to something, it doesn't matter because we haven't gotten it in writing. Or we'll refer to the policy or manual as opposed to thinking about what does it actually look like to care for someone else. You know, if someone says that harm is done against them, do we believe them, or do we say, well, let's look at the policy and let's try to figure out, okay, does this actually count as harm? Typically within white supremacy culture, there's only one right way. And paternalism is like rampant within the settlement sector, right? It's like we are graciously welcoming you into the country because Canada is this like father figure that's, you know, very generous and knows what's best for you and will tell you, okay, in order to succeed, you need to learn English and you need to get this qualification, and will dictate to you without listening to what you have to say back. Either or thinking, so thinking in binaries, either someone is, you know, a newcomer or they're not a newcomer. Either someone is a migrant or they're not a migrant. What about me? Like, I grew up in South Africa, but I was born with Canadian citizenship because my dad studied in Canada. And then I enter Canada and I need some of the services that newcomers would access, but because I haven't been applying for citizenship, I don't have access to any of those things. So there's very little space for nuance within the systems that exist under white supremacy culture. There's a lot of power hoarding, as many people spoke about, even in the way that our organizations are structured, right? We've got this hierarchy of like one or two people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom, as opposed to if we think of indigenous cultures or different ways of being that exist in circle, where power is shared a lot more fluidly. The fear of open conflict, I think, also refers back to this perfectionism, because we don't want to share something if it might get us into trouble. Or if something is an issue in the system, we're very hesitant to name it as an issue because we're scared of what might happen. There's a lot of individualism, so the sense that, like, you know, it's all about me and my needs, as opposed to being able to prioritize or even think beyond the self into like community needs and broader needs. Progress being more and bigger, the myth of objectivity. So even when someone is reading an application for citizenship or refugee status, the idea that the person who's reading it can have an objective lens on it, we know is not true, right? The very famous experiment of people looking at resumes that have racialized sounding names and white sounding names, and the exact same resume with white names will get a lot more callbacks, just shows the myth of objectivity that's like baked into the culture that we live in. And the final thing shows up a lot when we're trying to do anti-racism work, the right to comfort. So a lot of white people assume that they should be comfortable all the time. To experience any sort of discomfort is an infringement on their right. So when they're being called out, when they're being told the thing that you did is causing harm in communities, the way that you're operating is unjust, that's when the defensiveness comes up. It's when like a wall goes up, because any sort of discomfort is seen as like something that cannot be withstood or tolerated. So we've asked again in one of the Miro boards for folks to share where white supremacy shows up within their organizations or within the settlement agency as a whole. We don't have too much time to go over this, but maybe it's something that could be looked at in the, after the session or in some other time. So, some of the examples that have come through already, the sense of urgency being brought on by externally defined deadlines, quantity over quality, the fear of open conflict coming up, insensitivity when to white partners for the sake of relationship building, as opposed to like listening to the experiences of racialized people, the very vertical organizational structures. So these are just some of the ways that white supremacy culture is showing up in the settlement sector, and something worth paying attention to and spending some time on in your own reflections. So I don't think we'll have time to go through all of this in some details, but maybe those who have gone through this already, or anybody who would like to just share some reflections based on what we've shared around the tree of oppression, as well as the white supremacy culture. Thanks, Natasha and Torian, talking about those who are celebrated being model minorities and how that perpetuates that.
This is something that that's bugged me for a while, and I kind of know the answer to it. But how do you handle the issue of white supremacy and being white, or non-white for that matter? And these issues come up with the events that played out in the US and stuff. And there were lots of folks of color chanting white supremacy kind of rhetoric. And this is a question I've kind of grappled with to say, can a person of a color be a white supremacist? And within systems of oppression and organizational sort of mandates, when out with the boys, we always do the reference of the field. I won't use the field slave and the house slave. Okay, one is a very, very sort of academic question in terms of white supremacy and how it relates to race. The other part is confronting systems of power when you actually are dealing with folks that actually of color, that actually perpetuating those interests and separating at an organizational level, trying to do some advocacy or trying to advance an anti-racist agenda. But you have interests that are being perpetuated by folks that are non-white, but in positions of influence that are perpetuating that. They're kind of related. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Absolutely. So this is the nuance of anti-racism discussion that most trainings don't get into. Yeah. So the fact that internalized white supremacy is perhaps the single biggest legacy of colonialism to exist in the world. Yes. So my grandfather would only wear three-piece suits. He would only speak English in his home. He would refuse to speak any other language because in his mind, to be civilized is to be a white person. And to be a white person meant adopting all of these behaviors, right? Yes. And along with that came the elimination the value of the written word, perfectionism, all these things that we were talking about. And that's like within my grandfather, completely. He adopted all of that. And it's a multi-generational process to try and get rid of some of those internalizations. So my father was able to do some of that work. I'm able to do some of that work. So when we're meeting racialized folks who've got this high sense of internalized racism, my approach is empathy. Right? Because if we start fighting with one another, that's how like lateral violence happens, right? You're not woke enough. You're more white than the white people are. You're the one who's holding us back. It's your type of, like house N-word or, right? That's instead of saying, actually, I empathize with the fact that like you needed to adopt certain behaviors and beliefs because it allowed you to survive under a system of white domination. I appreciate that that's a strategy that you needed to employ. And working with that person to say, are you still in that situation where you need to adopt those habits? Or can we start unpacking where do those beliefs come from? How are they serving you? How are they serving the broader community? And this is that long, deep, emotional, personal, psychological work that needs to happen that gets very little support, right? Can you imagine the work that it needs to do? If your organization is going through anti-racism processes, all of this needs to happen, right? Like this is part of anti-racism work. But most often, anti-racism funding goes to white people to learn about racism. And it doesn't actually go towards racialized people to support them in their healing. Yeah. And I think this is a key point in trying to make this work really happen and be long lasting and bring that transformative change that we need.
Yeah. What you're saying, Aslam, is so interesting because I had a very weird encounter just 2 months ago. One organization who want to hire me to do training for them, and they want a whole day training for $600 anti-racism training. And I told them that I'm not going to do it. I'm not interested. They went around. I don't know who else they talked to, but a week later they came back to me and say, everyone we talk to, they say you are the expert. And I say, it's why I'm very expensive, because again, people expect us to do this work, to educate other white people, but how much they value that work and what is the price they put on it is something very debatable. And this is quite sad, very sad, because this work, as I always say, need to be done by everyone. But at the same time, we have to really acknowledge the work and acknowledge that we can't just undersold Black people or BIPOC people to do this work. And when it is about another white expert, they get the thousands. So that's the challenge also we have to think about it in our sector. Because the value of this settlement sector, the only way we can make it valuable and important, not only to the communities, but to the government, is when we start putting the price that come with it. But if we undersold ourselves and our resources and our people who are doing this work, then we can only get the less funding that we deserve. And oftentimes it is what happens. The funders want us to sell our service to the cheapest possible, because this is what they are used to. So there is work to be done to start talking about how we're going to also talk to the funders. Aslam, I was wondering, should we take a 3-minute break just for people to stretch and then we come back and finish?
Yeah, I think maybe I just want to emphasize the point about healing.
Yes.
Right? That like often when we think about anti-racism, to say what you said earlier, it's about guilt and it's about shame. But actually anti-racism is about healing from the ways that colonialism and white supremacy have damaged all of us.
Yes.
And I think that's the lens to bring into the immigration settlement sector as well. Because every newcomer who arrives on these shores has some healing that's needed.
Yes.
Right? They're healing from the trauma of, having American planes drop bombs on their land, right? Having their land invaded, having their governments toppled through all of these things require massive amounts of healing work. And that I think is part of the anti-racism work we need to do for every single person, especially for newcomers, if they're able to survive. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So I think that's for 3 minutes, just a stretch break, and then we'll come back for the final piece.
Oh, I have a better idea for the break. And I promise you, I want to tell anyone what you are doing behind your camera. There is a song that is making a big buzz in Africa. So I want to just share it with you for people who feel like they need a bit of dance. So go ahead, and we won't tell anyone. Okay. So as I say, we promise we won't tell anyone what you are doing behind the camera.
I was crying because you're making me miss home.
Yes. So, well, this is some of the good things, and yeah. So thank you so much. Should we go back to the things, Ashlam?
Yeah.
So we're going to the ladder. So we want to just maybe bring everything and together. And here is a framework that was developed by Barbara Thomas and Chris Novogrovsky. And they call it the ladder of discrimination. And it just says that when we talk about discrimination or racial discrimination, as we talked about it earlier on, the belief and the attitude, definitely the continuum go to the behavior and the action. So, but what you can see, there is more to racism and systemic racism than just behavior and attitude. There is a biases. The bias, especially preferences, biases, and especially unconscious bias and negative bias, when they are entrenched in our behaviors and attitude, they move to stereotype where you have a set image. As a Black person, I have come across a situation that was very, very disturbing many years ago in Vancouver, where at a coffee shop, there is this person walking around with their platter, and here I'm sitting at a big table by myself, and the person could join me, but I noticed for almost 2 minutes, they just couldn't decide to sit next to a Black person. And after I was amused, I just make a sign and expressly invite them. They came, and when I enter into conversation, why you are nervous? You look like nervous sitting with me. Say, oh, it is the first time I'm sitting with a Black person. I say, why? You don't know what a Black person say? Oh, I don't have anything against Black people, but in my country, people think all Black people are criminals. And that conversation was so interesting because at the end, I set the person up. And the way I did it, I just asked them, I say, in your country, you guys do movies. You have movie businesses that doesn't have anything to do with American movies. Since American movies, you see all Black people are criminals. What about the movies in your country? And they say, oh yeah, in my country, our movie, we have a lot of movies and plays and video clips. I say, who plays a bad role there? And the person say, well, it is actors from my country. I say, that means also in your country, there is criminal people there. Because if they can play the role on movies, that means in reality, they can do it in life. And the person realized then that I was setting them up and start laughing and apologizing. So, but for me, that stereotypes, that set image and negative image of people is another serious issue with racism. And then you have the prejudice. If you have a negative bias and a negative stereotype of someone, you will negatively prejudge them. And when you prejudge people, negative bias, negative stereotype plus negative prejudice, you have differential treatment or discrimination, as we say. Discrimination in the sense that it is impacting people in a way that it hinders their participation, whether in the organization or in society. The problem with systemic racism is that it can be entrenched in system in the sense that policies and practices can be the justification and the last resort for people who are doing racism. Oftentimes you hear people doing something that is totally racist and they say, I'm just doing my job. I don't have anything against you. So we invite you that when you're thinking about systemic racism, maybe use this tool and see how you're going to deconstruct how racism, is entrenched in your systems, in your organization, but also how you can train individuals at every single stage of this framework so that you can really help them to be fully anti-racist. So the next slide is the exercise we have then when we're talking especially about the systemic racism and the policy is using example from your own work and experiences. We would like to see you apply this policy and program assessment tool, or the ladder. We want you to apply it to situations where policies or program requirement in your sector has become a hindrance to anti-racism work and inclusion of BIPOC people in your organization. So again, Aslam has Miro board 5 up there in the chat. So we want to hear from people there. So Aslam, take it from here.
Thanks. So you'll see in this Miro board in your group, so the groups are numbered 1 to 12. Just on these 6 sticky notes to answer the question about where are policies or program requirements a hindrance to anti-racism or inclusion. So you've got 15 minutes in your group to work on that question together and using that policy ladder framework as a guide.
Okay. So we're getting people are coming back. Great. So you want to put the question up again, Aslam?
Yeah.
So thank you so much, everyone, for coming back. And we hope that although it was very short, the time was very short, but hopefully you have had some conversation and you can carry on with this later in your organizations and groups and teams. The question was, again, for you to apply the ladder to situation where policies or programs requirement have become a hindrance to anti-racism work and inclusion of BIPOC people in your organization. So let's briefly hear from a few people to share with us. We see in the chat there have been some very interesting posting. Yeah, so, and thank you so much. So can we hear from anyone who want to share briefly?
This is a quiet crowd, so I'll go again. This Prince. This is not so much so. I think we discussed with our folks that it's not so much the programs and policies being a hindrance, but programs and policies being an illusion of work being done, or sort of deception. It's kind of deceptive because especially if you work within a government setting, there's usually policies and procedures, diversity and inclusion documents and policies and stuff. The problem is most of them have no implementation framework, or instructionism, or groups come together on a quarterly or monthly basis and discuss these issues, but you never get a full picture of what really is the implementation plan of all these great ideas. So you've got these glossy documents, it's sitting there on everybody's desk. So if you were to complain about a diversity or inclusion sort of policy, then they might even appoint you to a department that actually exists, that we have this in place. So, so the presence of ineffective policies, ineffective in the sense that either they are not fully funded for any sort of implementation and they're just tables that are sitting there, or just folks not wanting to do anything, is one thing. And then we were looking again at the bias thing in terms of implementation. Like most of you LEAPs, the LEAP with focuses on social and economic integration of immigrants. And just the other day, I was talking to some of my colleagues within economic strategy, and the one gentleman just remarked to say, Prince, if all these immigrants are so highly skilled and professional and all this great experience, why should we be helping them? They shouldn't have problems getting jobs. Okay. And this is from someone that's really should be helping me in terms of economic integration and understanding the sort of biases and systemic discrimination and the hardships that immigrants face. So there is a certain lens, and this person was saying it quite frankly, truthfully, and I think they believed what they were saying. So it's those sort of
that's very, very interesting, Prince. I want to bring you back to that piece in terms of the qualification of the immigrant and why they should help themselves instead of the program. So do you want to say one thing about that? How can you change this mindset? Is there a suggestion or a recommendation you can make to us before we go to the next person?
Well, I'll tie this in with this bit I was going to say. The same individual just said, well, we can refer them to Ontario Works. We already fund Ontario Works if they need any assistance. And I'm like, do you know how many immigrants are on Ontario Works? 8 to 10%. The figures might have gone just slightly up now because of COVID. But traditionally, the people that are within sort of the Ontario Works are predominantly Canadian born, not immigrants. So this is to say, to change systems or to change perception from at least from a LEAP perspective, when we talk about economic integration of immigrants, we have to change the mindset of the gatekeepers to the economy. And unfortunately, the gatekeepers are either uninformed or blindly refusing to face the reality that immigrants do face specific barriers regardless of education and experience. So that whole ladder that you're talking about, from bias to discrimination, it ends up being as if everyone in that department or the majority in that department see it from that lens, it becomes discrimination in terms of how you design policies from an economic integration perspective. So you have to dismantle those ladders first before you even talk about integration.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think I hear you, and I like what you say in terms of the mindset, working on the mindset, working on the perception and the worldviews, but most importantly, looking at the policy and dismantling the way they are being structured. Is there any other comment from anyone in the room here? Thank you, Prince. Anyone else? Sorry, Morgan, it looks like the conversation is dropping for some people here. It is 11:33. We know that we are almost done with our time. Ashlam, anything you want to add before we close the conversation?
I think from my side, it's just a note of thanks to all of you for showing up and engaging. We know that this is difficult, especially over the online platforms that we're trying to do very complex work using. I think my final thing to say is that next week on the 25th, in 2 weeks' time, we'll be doing an Indigenous sharing circle with Marjorie Bouquet. If you'll notice that a lot of what we're trying to do is leaning to discomfort and trying to understand different ways of being that might give us more options on how we can change the systems around us. So more information will be available for this. And another thing is that in February, I'll be putting together something of a summary of the 3 conversations that we've been having. So drawing on the information that's in the Miro boards from the conversations that we've been having, as well as some other resources that we've been sharing. So if anybody wants to keep adding to the Miro boards, that will definitely help to inform the final product that's going to be distributed and shared throughout the LIP network. So yeah, I think that's it from me.
For me, I just want to say thank you again for being courageous enough to do this work. But as I told you, being aware of racism and learning about intervention, it is not only something that you have to shelf and put it aside. Anti-racism work, or especially anti-Black racism work, as George Sefardey from Toronto University said, anti-racism work is an action-oriented strategy, a plan, a program. So you have to have this strategy not only to talk about it and think about it, but it has to be action-oriented. And its main goal will have to be to do institutional or organizational systemic change to address racism, but most importantly, the intersections, meaning the interlocking systems of social operation. So we want to leave it with you, this last thought, that think about this, bring in people who can help you, and involve everyone, but also recognize people's participation and hard work in this process. Thank you again for having me, myself, and Aslam today. And Jesse and your team, thank you for the support. I'm going to post in the chat room again my email address. And so that's all I want to say. And I just want to say thank you so much. And it is beautiful here in Victoria, BC.
Thank you to you both. I just want to reiterate all the thanks that are coming in the chat from folks. Thank you very much, Musa and Aslam, for all the hard work and putting this together and working through the challenges. Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, again, you can reach out to me directly, Jesse, Renata. You have my email. And take care. Enjoy the rest of your day and weekend.
Take care. And happy Martin Luther King's birthday, Black Friday, Black T-shirt Day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Aslam, show us the T-shirt.
And I've got, if anyone hasn't seen, read Bell Hooks.
Oh,
so if you haven't read Bell Hooks, you need to.
Yes,
And it's actually from a Black-owned business called Melanin Rising. So if you want to support some Black-owned businesses and buy dope T-shirts in your anti-racism journey, check out Melanin Rising.